Next we have Angkana Huang, Huang from University of Cambridge.
Hello. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak after lunch. So let's get started. I was tasked to speak about methods to estimate the burden of dengue. So, before I dodge forward with the methods, I think, as Sharon just said, right, is burden is not a single word, right? You can think of infection burden, but you might also be thinking of disease burden. And I argue that even, if you think of this infection pyramid, right, which I know the proportions are not right, but it's okay. A majority of them will be subclinical, and I argue that the line that separates them is not so clear either, right? Depending on the context, what you might see as clinical or not clinical, or even in different societies might define them differently. But above that line, there's also cases that are not reported, and there are multiple reasons, as you already would have appreciated, and that some of them are due to the access to care, right, or even diagnostics. So in this talk, I will focus more on the infection burden, because that's more of universal in a way, which we can arrive at through infection risk. So if we can understand what is the infection risk in the past, we can then reconstruct back the infection burden, and that will become the denominator for your disease burden. Okay, so how do we get at infection burden, though? So I hope that I'm not wrong, but ideally, if we have all the resources in the world, we would install cohort studies in all the communities that we love, and we would just monitor them to our heart's content, and actually find people who seroconverted, seroconverted, whatever that new tool might be, and then we'll be able to see, what is the infection risk in this population, given that it's representative of the population. Usually, we're not there, so we opt for cross-sectional seroprevalence studies, which, as you know, just to reiterate the obvious, is that if the climbing of the seropositivity is low, so it slowly, gradually increases with age, then you have lower infection risk compared to a population that has faster increase with age, right? But a data stream which has been proposed already for 2 decades, and I think is still underappreciated, is using case data to inform infection risk, right? So we know that these cases that show up, and of course different contexts, you can question whether they're truly dengue or not, and there are ways to address that, but they are infections, right? But these are not just whatever infections, but they are infections that show up as clinical and relevant enough such that they get reported. And in the old regime or the current regime, like in Thailand, you can kind of ascribe that mostly to second infections, but I'll relax that after this, right? So yes, we now have at least 3 ways to infer this infection risk. The question is, if we only had one of the data sets, would the infection risk that we get be the right picture of what's happening underneath, right? Which we really don't know. So we use this opportunity where we have 4 series of cohort studies and actually 5 now ongoing. In a location, this is Kampang Phet, Thailand, right? That is coexistent with this other hospital-based surveillance that we set up for the same time period of 20 years. And we can use these cohort studies which have longitudinal serology. That's one data stream. We can actually pick one blood sample per person to emulate cross-sectional serology across the time period. And we can also use these case data to actually infer the infection risk in the same population. If we do that using quite a naive approach, but I would argue predominant in the literature of inferring the infection risk, what you get is this, right? It turns out if we assume that these cohort studies, these longitudinal serology are the ground truth, so our cross-sectional serology and case counts actually underestimating by a lot this infection risk? Turns out it's not quite the answer that we got from the study. So it turns out that this tighter kinetics and assay noise, we might have differing assays that might be more reliable, but still there will be some variability in the readouts. And if you consider this tighter kinetics of, let's say, an individual that was born into the population, in this graph, I'm not including maternal antibodies, so assuming that that has waned out, you have this like people with naive titers. And then once you get your first, let's say, cross-reactive infection or like a JEV vaccine like in Thailand that we have, then you might have this low level of titer that may turn out to be falsely positive, so that's the yellow above this threshold line. Now, once you get your first dengue infection, you have this rise followed by quite a rapid decay of around less than a year. And then to some level that hopefully is higher than before, but still you could turn false negative like in the blues. Again, if you get infected, then you might get boosted, and we can argue about this tighter kinetics. But because of this nuance, imagine that you enroll people that are in the blues, and then you follow them next time, in the next interval, they have quite a high probability of turning positive. So you end up almost always inflating this estimate. But I'm not saying that this is always the case. So it's very nuanced depending on the landscape that you're working at, the population, what was the age group that you're looking at, where do they lie in this time, basically, right? So in a low force of infection setting, it might be a higher age group that is experiencing their first infection. All right, so if we take these nuances into account, and we try, basically, use a model structure such that the two serological data streams actually do agree with one another. And remember, they're from the same cohort studies, so that we know is true. Then we can estimate the force of infection or the infection risk in brown, and we independently, so we did not force this, from the case counts, and that's in blue. And you can see now that the magnitudes do line up. What we had to do, actually what did show up also due to the need to agree between the serological study data streams, is that we also found that there's elevated infection risk in this children and teenagers age group. So, we often think that mosquitoes are actually biting independently, but somehow in this age group, there's higher infection risk, at least in Kampangpet. And we did not only see that, but in a previous study, I've also shown through case data that actually we do see this elevated risk throughout Thailand. And I would love to see whether this holds true in other settings. So coming back, I've addressed one thing, which is if we have these multiple data streams, would they agree? And then there's also differences in nuances across settings, depending on your transmission level, especially in terms of serology. Another diversity that I think we have to take into account, actually the data does show that we have to take into account, is endemicity, right? The methods that we have been using and prevailing in the literature has been developed from the few countries that were highly endemic in the past, right? Like places like in Thailand. Yes, even though all the serotypes are not equally circulating, or at least the data shows that it's not equally circulating, but they kind of tally out over a few years. In re-emerging settings like in Brazil, that's not really the case, right? And I would argue that many emerging settings are not the same. You often get these bursts of outbreaks prevailed by some serotype, and then they disappear, and then some other serotype shows up. You don't really know how many serotypes are really there. And so from previous sort of these methods that we have been using, where we kind of assume that the four serotypes are having similar infection risks or interchangeable, if we are wrong, we'll tally out in the next few years. So the way we bucket people is you're either naive, you have not seen dengue, you have seen dengue once, twice, 3 times, or 4. I think we have to relax this assumption and start to probabilistically sort out in the models which serotypes you have been exposed to, and therefore be able to now take into account, let's say that like in this illustrative figure, it will be that serotype 1 was circulating a lot in this year, and then it might be doing that for multiple years, and therefore even though you have had one infection this year, next year not going to get infected again because it's still the same serotype, right? And if we do that, then this is preliminary work, but we can actually then take in, and this is not even serotype data for every case count. Actually, it's just like in Brazil, it's less than 1%, right, that are being typed. But we can still reconstruct back what is the force of infection by serotype and get at the type-specific seroprevalence, if you will. And I would love to see and then this becomes sort of, the next question is, how valid is this, right? We now have data in seroprevalence studies to actually triangulate this, and this seems to map really well. But assays are improving now, and we're having more and more type-specific responses that can be used to validate these types of results, and I think that's what will be emerging in the next few years in terms of research. All right, so just to wrap things up, and I'm so glad I am so good with time. Yeah, it's like 8 minutes left. So I have touched on the first nuance, which is the data type, right? We have 3 data types at least that are prevailing. Of course, we can add on to more and more types of data as the assays become available. So each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, right? Yes, I did point to longitudinal serology. I did not say that we should not do them. They are super valuable, and we do them. And there are questions that it's very hard to get at without cohort studies, but at the same time, the analytics will have to be more complicated, and we just have to accept that. Cross-sectional serology is helpful in many settings, like places where there is no reported case counts, there's no case count to actually fit to, right? But there are also places where there are a lot of burden, but there is lack of assays, and therefore these age-annotated case counts could really help. So those are the types, data type considerations. And now in terms of methods, of course, it has to reflect the data types that you have, but it's also the settings, right? I don't think we could universally use a single method, or at least not carefully consider what are the assumptions in each method to apply to different places. And yeah, so at the end of the day, you will get some infection risk. You might be able to, you will be able to then reconstruct what is the exposure history in this population, and hopefully we can then, with a lot of other research, reconstruct the immune landscape that's in the population. So with that, I think in this non-exhaustive list of collaborators, but also stress really strongly on the contributions of the study cohort teams and the study participants that have been tolerating us really well. All right, thank you.